Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Fall 2023 Virtual Washington Summit. We have much to talk about today in light of recent House votes in our state revolving funds, so our WebEx housekeeping will be brief. Today's opening session will be recorded. It will be available on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via NUCA.com. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of Zach Berconti's presentation. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I'll read them at the conclusion of Zach's discussion. Now let's get started. I would like to introduce Doug Carlson, Chief Executive Officer for NUCA.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to NUCA's Virtual Washington Summit. It's been a couple months since we met in person in DC. We've had a lot of activity, but I want to thank you for your time this morning to participate in our advocacy program. We have several important topics we need to discuss, and top of the agenda is the 2024 EPA Appropriations Bill. Last Friday, the House voted to cut nearly $2 billion from our industry's state revolving funds and replace much of this funding with individual earmarks. This is a catastrophically bad idea. We are asking you to engage with your lawmakers on what drives our industry and what we need from Congress to build the clean water and wastewater projects that are needed in our communities. The Senate version of this legislation keeps the SRF funding intact, and we urge Congress to pass that version of the final bill. We cannot build or repair the nation's crumbling water and wastewater infrastructure without adequate resources. We will also talk about workforce development. We'll talk about apprenticeships, H-2B visa reform, and opposing mandatory project labor agreements on our workforce. And finally, we need to further develop our relationships with our lawmakers and their staffs. They want to hear from you, the constituent. Please follow up with your lawmakers, thanking them for their time. Invite them and their staffs out to a local job site. It's a huge impact. Please meet back here online at 4:30 this afternoon to talk about meetings and what you've learned, especially those with meetings with senators. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Tom Butler, NUCA's Chairman of the Board and our Governmental Affairs Committee Chairman.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for being on this call and for doing the virtual summit today. Can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedules to participate in our virtual summit. You're helping yourself, you're helping our chapters, you're helping our industry. So thanks. Mission today is simple. We've already heard that the House cut $2 billion in state revolving funds. Thankfully, it's not solely up to the House to make that decision. So we need to make sure that everybody understands what will happen to our communities if our projects are not funded. And the Senate must realize that this nation is counting on them to reverse the House's mistakes and fund these two vitally important EPA loan programs. We also need to emphasize our recurring workforce shortages and that we are looking for Congress to help. I'm sure we're not telling you anything you don't already know there for sure. Our summit website is a resource you can share with your lawmakers. We have several issue fact sheets that they can view and learn more about our issues. You can also share our talking points with them. It's all public record. Get them the links, get them the downloads, and we want them for their own discussions, have them in their hands so that they can share them with their coworkers and their colleagues. Zach Berconti is going to delve into the details of this summit and how we got here and what we see as the path forward to restoring those federal loan resources. We also want to educate Congress on our SRF issues so they won't make the same mistake when they start to work on the fiscal year 2025 bills. Zach, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and good morning, everyone. So I am going to go ahead and dive right into our morning briefing. We have a fair amount of stuff that we've been working on at National. It has been a very, very busy fall. And by far and away, the issue that's taken up the most of my time and the thing that I think we need your help on the most really is fighting to preserve those appropriations for next year for the state revolving fund programs. So if we dive right in to our first slide here, you heard from Doug some of our other industry priorities. We want to keep fighting on the workforce development side. We want to keep making sure that construction has access to important programs like the H-2B visa program, and that Congress provides our industry with the resources that we need to meet the workforce capacity challenges that our industry is facing. But by far and away, our biggest issue, and the one thing, if nothing else, we would like you to discuss with your lawmakers today, is preserving those fiscal year 2024 state revolving fund appropriations. As you heard earlier, the House of Representatives did recently pass their fiscal 24 Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill. That bill contains a proposal to cut $1.7 billion from the EPA state revolving funds. To put this into perspective, for that bill's entire EPA budget, they've looked to cut that fund by 39%, or about $4 billion. So nearly half of those EPA cuts are coming directly from this one program, which by all accounts is a very successful program. The EPA state revolving funds are very bipartisan. They have a very high level of approval on both sides of the aisle. Every state uses this program. This is not something that is relied upon only by one part of our country. It serves projects in every congressional district and all corners of the United States. So to see Congress having just approved a tremendous investment in that program through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, now only a couple of years later, passed through the House of Representatives a proposal to essentially zero out that appropriations fund is very disheartening. And to make matters worse, not only have they proposed this $1.7 billion in cuts, but they're continuing and doubling down on a bad precedent of directing most of the remaining funding as grants through congressional earmarks to specific water projects. Now, when we discuss those projects, we have to be a little careful how we talk about them, because at the end of the day, you all are still doing the work on these jobs, and these projects that are being funded are very important to their communities. There's no doubt that the overwhelming majority of projects that are being given an earmarked grant are necessary and important to the health of their communities. But the issue here really does focus on how Congress is choosing to fund them. In the past, water projects, when they received an earmark, that funding was not taken out of the state revolving fund program. It was an additional appropriation. By taking that money out of the state revolving fund, it's going out as a grant, not a loan, which means it is not going to return down the line when that loan would be repaid to the overall pool of funding. That's the biggest issue. By making this policy choice, Congress is not only cutting the state revolving fund program this year, but we're also going to see effectively a cut to that program every year in perpetuity as a result of all of that lost loan income being repaid back into the fund. Now, the second issue with them taking that approach is that Congress is not made up of water policy professionals. It's not made up of industry experts like you all. The projects that they've chosen may not all be the highest priority for communities of need. And so there are communities across the country that are counting on receiving state revolving fund dollars to fund very important projects. Some of those projects may themselves even be the result of grants to small and disadvantaged communities under the program's normal rules. None of those communities will be receiving the dollars they're counting on because Congress has chosen to send them elsewhere. Some states will be receiving significantly less money that they would under normal funding formulas. And across the board, 40 plus states will be receiving effectively less than $1 million in funding that they can use through their normal state revolving fund intended use plans. So in other words, that, what I've just told you, breaking that down, the takeaway there really is this bill zeroes out appropriations for 2024 for the state revolving fund program. Now, why did Congress choose to do this? Well, the thought process among many is we're in a tough fiscal environment. There's a very strong desire in the House of Representatives right now to bring down the deficit. And they've said that means they need to make tough decisions. The chair of the Interior and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee, Republican Mike Simpson from Idaho, actually said when he was introducing this bill that it's an ugly bill. It's not a pretty bill, were his exact words. They had to make what they saw as necessary tough choices. But frankly, this is not a good choice to make. We all know how expensive an emergency repair job is. We also know the economic benefits of investing in water infrastructure. And if your lawmakers, bring that up and start talking about this from a fiscal perspective, just remind them that water is not something you can afford to ignore when it breaks. Eventually that bill is going to come due. And when it does, it's going to cost a lot more than if we'd invested in it now. So I will go into a little more detail on this in a future slide. But what I really want to leave you all with is when we have this conversation today, and when your lawmakers want to know what you're proposing they do about it, ask them to support the Senate's proposal. The Senate's Interior and Environment Appropriation Bill cleared committee unanimously, and it contains level funding with 2023 for the State Revolving Fund Program. So it does not have a cut at all. Now, what we really want to see is an increase. I don't need to remind anybody here that that's been a top advocacy item for us for a very long time. When you consider things like inflation, when you consider, price increases for labor and materials, and the overall increased cost of compliance and necessary system maintenance for water projects all over the country, we need more funding, not less. But when compared to the alternative, level funding is probably the best we're going to get. And so at a minimum, we would like to see, when both chambers sit down for negotiations, that they quickly adopt the Senate's proposal and back away from the edge of the cliff. So we'll talk a little bit about more about that in future slides, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that at the end. But just as a reminder, some of the other industry priorities that you may like to discuss, following up on continued implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're still waiting on additional Build America, Buy America, or BABA guidance from some of the individual agencies. The Office of Management and Budget back in August finally released their final guidance to the agencies for each individual program to set their rules. That does mean that rules on what is and what is not compliant under these domestic preference requirements does vary slightly from agency to agency. And we're still waiting on additional clarity from folks like the EPA and the Department of Transportation on exactly what rules contractors, distributors, and manufacturers are expected to follow. We're also, of course, all very closely eyeing the funding rollout, waiting to see how long it's going to take these dollars to really make an impact on the market. We discussed workforce development. One thing that I do want to flag for everyone is there is a proposal that may soon be introduced in the Senate that would cut construction almost entirely out of the H-2B visa program. That would make it almost impossible for construction employers to access that. It is not a priority for us for this summit. That legislation has not been introduced yet. But if you do discuss H-2B visa reform or immigration, it is worth bringing up that, again, construction should not be closed off from an avenue to hire when we really need support from Congress to close the workforce gap. Permitting reform is always on the agenda. We made tremendous strides earlier this year under the debt ceiling agreement, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that started the process of overhauling and streamlining federal permitting reforms under the National Environmental Policy Act. There is still a lot of more room to streamline that process. We're still waiting on the administration to implement the changes to the law. But this is always a good opportunity when you're meeting with your lawmakers to talk about how the permitting process has slowed down your work and outgrown its intended purpose of environmental protection into a confusing and difficult morass of red tape. And then, of course, there are always things like labor and regulatory issues, such as the OSHA worker walk-around representative rule that would allow individuals from third parties, be they union or community organizers, be they attorneys for employees that are looking to sue your company, be they competitors that are looking to gain access to trade secrets, all potentially allowed on your job sites. We've talked about that rule at length recently. We talked about it at convention as well. It's not something, again, we'd like you to spend a lot of time on, but if it is something that you've read up a lot on and you're really fired up about, certainly worth flagging to your members of Congress, even if that ultimately is a rulemaking that'll have to go through the administration. And then last, but certainly not least, we're still waiting on the House of Representatives to bring up the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration reauthorization legislation that's pending in committee. The Senate is even further behind the House at this point, from the best of our knowledge. They have yet to really produce a lot of draft text and are kind of waiting to see what the House is doing. But always good opportunities to talk about the importance of damage prevention if the conversation moves in that direction. If I can get the next slide. Thank you. So just as a reminder for everybody, this is kind of what's at stake here. The bipartisan infrastructure law was a tremendous amount of federal investment in our industry and in other parts of America's infrastructure. This is part of the reason why some folks in Congress think that it's appropriate to consider cutting our state revolving fund programs. The attitude is that we have all of this money from the in the SRFs from the bipartisan infrastructure law, from IIJA. We have that money in the system, and it can backfill the cuts. We can make do with what they've given us. Now, the problem with that approach, of course, is that by doing that, they're effectively canceling out a fair amount of the impact of this program. You'll see we have $55 billion for water and wastewater infrastructure over 5 years. So what's the problem with a $2 billion cut? Well, when you look at the actual year-to-year breakdown of how that goes between the SRFs, $2 billion is a big chunk, of an annual appropriation. And the consequence of that is, one, not only do we need every dollar we have access to, but two, folks were already relying on that money being in the system. And so, cutting that expected annual appropriation means that they're going to have to shift some of this money from the bipartisan infrastructure law into, projects that had already been expected to move forward. Like I said, essentially canceling out a fair amount of the impact of this legislation. Next slide, please. So speaking of that bill, it's worth reminding folks, we are very, very close to the 2-year anniversary at this point. This legislation passed in November 2021. By last year, they had started to put a lot of the programs and timelines in place. This year, they've really stood a lot of those offices up. The administration has hired a lot of people. States have hired a lot of people to move that money. And they've increasingly ramped up the pace of announcing where dollars are going and begun to distribute more of that money. So by last November, about 185 billion out of the total 550 billion in new spending had been announced or distributed. They had a lot of ground to catch up. This year, we're still waiting on some new figures. You can expect next week the administration will probably do a big press push to announce and update everyone on the status of the funding rollout. But that money has increasingly moved from just being announced to actually being distributed. As of August, state highway funds have received over $125 billion, which supported over 50,000 projects. We've had nearly 3,000 bridge repair and replacement projects fully funded as a result of this legislation. States have committed almost $90 billion in highway projects. Water funding is slowly beginning to reach states through the state revolving fund programs and begun to go out to jobs as well. I think what's really important to spotlight when we talk about this legislation today is that there is at least one project funded by this legislation underway in every single congressional district. So I'm going to say that again. There is at least one project funded by this legislation in every single district right now. So this is not something that any congressman doesn't have a direct stake in, right? Cutting the state revolving fund is going to impact everyone. And you can point to this legislation to say that. There's active work going on in your district right now. By making these SRF cuts, you're directly undercutting the benefits of this legislation. So just, to real quickly touch on a couple of other things to kind of give you a snapshot of where we are. The broadband money was finally announced to states in June. That will roll out over the course of the next year, and then states will have most of the rest of the decade to start giving that to projects. And then we already talked a little bit about the Office of Management and Budget's BABA guidance. Many of these projects are still in the planning stages, and some of those will be relying both on the emergency appropriations, emergency supplemental appropriations, they call them, from the bipartisan infrastructure law for the state revolving funds. And others will be, still at least in part relying on the expected annual appropriations. So those cuts will directly impact some jobs that, were intended to have a split funding source between IIJA, BIL, and the expected annual appropes. Next slide, please. So we mentioned earlier, as we started, Secretary Buttigieg, when he had an oversight hearing earlier this year, he contextualized it by saying, one way to think about IIJA, BIL rollout is if their first year was about the bill passing and the second year was about the programs launching, this is about the money moving so we can get the dirt flying. Next year is expected to be a very, very busy year for construction, at least according to everybody in DC. That is when that money will really start to make an impact in the market, especially in water. Now, whether the administration is able to keep that promise, we'll see. They certainly have a strong incentive to do that. Next year is an election year. And after last night's local elections in Virginia, Kentucky, Mississippi, New Jersey, and other states, we are fully transitioning to the presidential election cycle. So there's going to be a lot of attention on where this bill goes. This is, by many readings, one of the administration's biggest accomplishments. And now folks are going to see, is it actually making a difference in our communities? They're not going to see that unless they can see construction actively going on in not just the roads, but in these other very important utility markets like the ones that we serve. Next slide, please. So this is kind of contextualizing these SRF cuts, right? You can see that when you break down their estimated national allotment by program, and this is just the emergency supplemental funding that came from IIJA, BIL. When you look at fiscal 2024, we're talking about a $2 billion cut spread across the clean water SRF and the drinking water SRF, right? That is a big chunk of the funding for both programs. Okay, each of them is only receiving about 2.4 billion. So when you take that cut, and it's distributed not entirely evenly, it is divided and slanted a little more towards one than the other. You do see that represents a significant portion of the annual estimated appropriation. It doesn't, when you factor in the lead line replacement, quite as much, but for other projects, this places the health of that program significantly at risk. There is a very great article that the Washington Post put out back in July that talks a little more about the consequences of what having those SRF cuts signed into law would be for the program. We've shared it aggressively. It has been on NUCA's social media many, many times. You've seen it in your newsletters, and I have sent that to lots of offices on the Hill. But one of the parts of that article that really sticks out with me, in the course of their interviews, they spoke with the head of Colorado's state revolving fund program. And he just very honestly says, if these cuts go through, our loan fund is at risk of running dry within a few years, right? They already have more projects, even with this estimate or this emergency funding. They already have more projects that they need to serve than they can fully fund. They have to turn people away. And this should not be a surprise to anybody on this call, but for many in Congress, I think it is. So it's very, very important that we emphasize, relative to 55 billion over 5, 2 billion in cuts doesn't sound like a lot. But when you look and see what we're actually getting for 2024, 2 billion in cuts is a big chunk of that. Next slide, please. So water funding challenges, even with that money, as I've said, are very, very high. And three numbers that I want people to remember. 625 billion is needed over the next 20 years to maintain drinking water infrastructure in the United States. That's a very new number that was released just before our in-person Washington summit. It's a 32% increase from the last time the EPA measured that 5 years ago. That's over $130 billion, right? Over a 5-year period. So 55 billion for clean water and drinking water versus $132 billion 20-year estimated need increase for drinking water alone. You can see how far behind we are. We're not treading water here. We're just drowning slower. Now, it gets worse. There are 271 billion that will be needed over that same period for wastewater stormwater treatment. That is a number from 2012. The EPA is still working on their latest Clean Watersheds Needs Assessment. When that figure is released, I would expect it to be substantially higher. Even if it's not, that number, 271 billion, that's 2012 dollars. That's not 2023 dollars. So, even just inflation adjusted, our estimated 20-year needs for drinking water are likely north of $1 trillion for drinking water, clean water, stormwater. The other thing that I do want to spotlight for folks, for the first time, the EPA actually did assess the location and number of active lead service lines in use. They found that there are 9.2 million, which is on the higher end of previous estimates. Now, prior to them doing this survey, the assumption in Congress was that this was really an issue that was localized to the Northeast and to urban centers like Chicago. That is absolutely not the case. They found that the states with the highest total number of lead service lines include Florida and Texas. It's not just Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, the places you might expect. This is a problem that is affecting districts nationwide. And so, every single member of Congress has yet another reason to be personally invested in fully funding these programs. And if they doubt that, it's also worth reminding folks that the Cannon House office building is currently in a major renovation. In the early stages of that renovation, they found active lead lines in use in the Capitol building. So this is not something that they can escape, even if the pipes are, freshly fixed back at home. This is an issue that affects all of them every single day. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on this one here, and then I think we're going to kind of move into our wrap up and questions. So this is a little outdated at this point. It's some of the newer numbers they have, but it's a state level summary of bipartisan infrastructure law funding as of August. You can see billions of dollars have started to be announced and rolled out to states. But I think this is just another good number to keep perspective. When we're talking about $2 billion in cuts, that's a lot of money. And Congress, they throw around $1 billion here, $1 billion there, like it's change sometimes. But, when you stack that up against the amount of funding that some states have received already, $2 billion is a lot of money. There's a lot of good that we can do nationwide if they keep that funding in the state revolving funds where it belongs. And I think it's just worth reminding members of Congress, how many projects are going to go unfunded if they don't follow through with this. There's another resource that we didn't distribute directly to everyone because it is specific to one single district. But the American Business Water Coalition, another trade group, they just put out a survey they did on the intended use plan of Idaho, and specifically Idaho's 2nd district, which is the subcommittee chair Mike Simpson's district. And they pulled the state revolving funds, or the state's intended use plan, and identified over 80 projects in the state of Idaho and over 70 in his district that are going to not be funded as a result of these cuts. So there is a tremendous amount of work that's going to have to be pushed off if Congress follows through with this. And it's going to really hurt a lot of these states that were counting on that money as a part of their bipartisan infrastructure law plans and as a part of their normal year-to-year intended use plans for those SRF dollars. Next slide, please. So the infrastructure law implementation challenges, I'm just going to run through these again here real quick. These are some other things that you can discuss, right? Again, BABA requirements. We still need more clarity from the agencies. OMB has finally done their part. Now we need that final guidance from the other agencies, and Congress can help put some pressure on them to talk to us if they have questions that's holding up the process. Workforce development, you all know about this issue better than I do and better than anybody in Congress. Talk about the issues that are facing you, talk about the issues that are facing your company. This is going to be the big bottleneck in rolling out all of this federal infrastructure investment. You can't put something in the ground if you don't have somebody there to put it in there. Appropriations, of course, are our biggest one. I am going to kind of back up a little bit here and just spotlight a couple things about how that House vote went down. So as I said, the House did pass this bill, HR 4821. They passed that last week. NUCA had a very active grassroots campaign going into that vote. Many of you, if you're in my grassroots system, you received at least one, if not two or three, emails from me asking you to write to Congress. If you did not, please go to our website, nuca.com/advocacy, where you can find our muster sign-up link as well as our active campaigns. We've updated that campaign now to reflect where we are in the process, and we'll be sending out another grassroots message that goes to both the House and the Senate sometime in the near future. Our last message was asking members of Congress to vote against the bill. That was not something that NUCA often does on appropriations bills. And while we don't have a key vote system like some other associations, we actually weighed in specifically on the amendments process and did come as close as we could to calling a key vote on 3. Now, under House rules, to get a little technical, they cannot offer amendments that would increase the deficit on a bill. Any amendment you put forward has to be paid for. 3 amendments were offered that recognized how badly this bill underfunds water infrastructure. There was a bipartisan amendment that recognized it specifically for rural water systems. There was an amendment from one Democrat out in Colorado that recognized the critical importance of these programs. And there was another one by Congresswoman Amelia Sykes from Ohio that symbolically fully restored funding for both the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds for next year. Now, it's a symbolic amendment. There's something called an increase-decrease, where effectively they give you the money and they take it back away. Just a message on this issue in order to comply with House rules. But the important thing is those 3 amendments were all offered by Republican congressional leadership as part of a broader amendment package, adopted and passed as part of the full bill. So in the current language that they have sent to the Senate, they specifically recognize how underfunded they've made an appropriation for water infrastructure next year. That's a big messaging win for us. And the fact that we didn't even need to go to a vote on it, they just included it in their amendment that they adopted by voice vote, is a big deal for us. Now, of course, symbolically restoring the funding isn't the same thing as restoring the funding, and that's why we did recommend a no vote. We had 3 Republicans actually follow through and vote against the bill. One of those 3, Congressman Mark Molinaro from New York's 19th congressional district, was one of the individuals that offered one of those water amendments. And when I sat down with his office, they specifically told us, and also released a statement to the same effect, that their vote against this bill was because in part of the cuts to water infrastructure programs. So we're in a good position right now. The House has recognized that they have not done their job when it comes to funding water. They have a lot more they need to do. That sets us up, I think, very well for negotiations between the House and the Senate once the Senate passes their bill. But that's really where you all come in. They failed to fully fund a lot of these IIJA programs. The water funding cuts, while they're making the right noises about reversing them, are still in the language they've passed. We really cannot afford to just assume that the Senate is going to bail us out here. I don't need to tell anybody how unusual of a Congress it has been. We're on our 2nd Speaker of the House. Speaker Johnson is a little bit of a wild card compared to Kevin McCarthy. We don't necessarily know what approach he's going to take when it comes to the rest of the appropriations process. And they have 10 days right now, not even, to avoid a government shutdown. There's a lot of focus and a lot of pressure on them to move quickly. And when they're moving quickly, we can't afford to have them overlook the SRFs. So That is by far and away our biggest focus. It's why there's only one area on your talking points. It's why there's only one fact sheet that we've distributed. But the remainder of the topics that you might like to discuss, all of that information that's on WeDigAmerica.org for our other areas that we talked about in May is still, for the most part, current. Those other fact sheets that are up there are still up to date. And you can rely on those to support any discussions you have about other topics of importance to our industry. And then I talked earlier about labor and regulatory issues, so I'm not going to repeat that, but these are always things that we're very keeping active in, keeping a close eye on. It's been a regulatory fire hose from the Biden administration, and we're just doing our best to spotlight these areas of importance for Congress. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that I put up back in May, and I think it's always just kind of a good one to run through again. How do you talk to your members of Congress? What I would say to you all is don't try to play junior lobbyist. Don't be me. You have a much more important skill set than I do, frankly, and that's you actually know what happens in this industry, what happens in your companies, what happens on the ground outside the Beltway on a day-to-day basis. I've thrown a lot of stuff about specific regulations at you, specific legislation, bill numbers. I've talked about, the ins and outs of the process on Capitol Hill. That's all just background for you. You really don't need to go into all of that. What you need to talk about is what's important to you. How does this affect your industry? What are the practical changes that you're going to see if this funding cut goes through? What work is going to fall off? What are some important water projects that are happening in your district, in your communities, that might be impacted by them going through with these cuts? So tell your story, right? Talk about what's happening to you on the ground, and then tie that back to the talking points. So don't read from a script. Don't just go down the bullets. This is all public information. We're encouraging you to send this to them directly. Just use that as reference and support for you as you talk about what's happening at home. So use them as a guideline for your conversation. Use them as your scaffolding, but don't use them as a one-to-one rule. Don't feel like you've got to hit everything on there. Just really have a conversation, talk about what you know, and bring those in to support that argument. So talk about why that would help. This legislation is going to help and harm your business and community is really the takeaway. Above all, you really do need to relate it to your personal experience. Make it personal for the member of Congress. Tie it back, and their staff, tie it back to their districts, tie it back to their states. You can always throw in, once again, that they've found lead lines in use in the Capitol office buildings. This is an issue that they can't escape from, even if they wanted to. This affects every single person in every single congressional district. And as I said, there's at least one bipartisan infrastructure law project happening now in every single corner of the United States. This isn't a bill that, even if they voted against it, that anyone should want to see fail. Above all, as well, our other ask is always do look for opportunities to follow up after the meeting. Everyone here has heard me say it before, I'm sure. What's important to me is your advocate here in DC is that I'm not the only one that Congress hears from all year. I want to keep this conversation going between you and your lawmakers and their staff more than just in May and more than just this virtual summit. That's part of the reason why we're doing this, is to give everyone either an opportunity to meet directly with their lawmakers on a call, or to send them the fact sheets and the information and try to set up a time to talk about this in the future. One thing that, of course, is always good is to meet with them in person, not in DC, but back home. And so, especially since we'll be seeing our lawmakers through computer screens today, please ask them for some sort of opportunity to bring them to one of your job sites or to one of your chapter's events, or to even just your company's headquarters, so you can talk with them a little more about these issues and about the stuff that you do day to day. Those conversations, I think, are more helpful to our industry than anything we do in DC. There is no substitute for firsthand experiences and directly seeing what these projects look for and the benefits that they bring to communities. So, your closing thought for just about all of these meetings should be an invitation to speak with them again. And on that note, I am available throughout the day to support. I'm also available afterwards to support. When you send a follow-up email to the people you're meeting with today, the best thing I think that can come from a conversation is an opportunity to answer a question they asked. If there's something that comes up in the call you don't know the answer to, when you send them that follow-up, please CC me. And if I can't get you the answer immediately before then, I can jump in and provide some extra help there. It just gives us an opportunity to keep that conversation going. Next slide, please. So I want to throw out a little bit of schedule and logistics information here. Just as a reminder to everyone, all of our information, the meeting schedule, talking points, etc., all of that is available at WeDigAmerica.org. If you have virtual meetings that you haven't put in the spreadsheet yet, please do upload those. I know quite a few folks have scheduled some and have yet to put that information into the spreadsheet. That's how we can, at National, track who we're talking to, and if we're going to jump on any meetings, that's how we'd get the information. If there are any in particular you'd like us to be on as well, please send that info to me, to Tom Butler, and to Doug Carlson, and we will do our best to join you when we can. Now, additional NUCA advocacy materials are all available at either nuca.com/advocacy, nuca.com/fixwater, and nuca.com/PHMSA 2023. That contains some of the supporting documents that we've used over the past couple of years, and some additional background information on the other topics that aren't in this virtual summit's fact sheet. Please remember to share any supporting documents you reference with congressional offices. That, of course, includes both our talking points and our fact sheet, but also anything else that you might reference during the call that comes from one of those above links. Please, take that attachment and send that along as well. Our virtual wrap-up session will be on WebEx at 4:30 p.m. If you can join us, please do. That'll just be an informal conversation. That won't be recorded. Just a dialogue between us and you all about how your meetings went, what information did you get, did things work, did things not work? Just an informal debrief that will put a bow on the day. With that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. If we move to the next slide, my contact information is there. If you don't have it already, please feel free to reach out to me throughout the day. I'm happy to answer questions or support however I can.
If you'd like to present a question, you can either unmute yourself and ask Zach directly, or you can write it in our chat session and I'll read it out.
Hey, Zach, it's Christine from Colorado and Arizona.
Hi, Christine, go for it.
So you referenced a couple of specific Colorado items when you were talking. Is that on We Dig America as well, or is that something that you can kind of possibly send me so that I can personalize the conversation a little bit more?
Absolutely. We can make sure that you get that article. I am not entirely sure at the moment if we have posted that link on our website, but we can certainly make sure that it's available there as well.
And it is, just FYI to everybody on there, it's WeDigAmerica.org.
Yes. Yep. WeDigAmerica.org and NUCA.com.
We'll have closing remarks from Doug.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I think Zach went over a lot of information. And again, participation is critical. Even if you don't have meetings today, please forward us on to your members. The recording will be available on our YouTube site. Engagement is critical in representing our funding that we need so desperately. So again, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll see everybody back here at 4:30.